Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing as well as analysing tech news, which as usual has popped up in the past 24 or so hours. Hope you're all having an amazing day and prepping for a fantastic weekend. As usual, we have an awful lot of stuff to get through in this video, so I want to start out with news concerning AMD and their next generation Zen processors and the next generation AM4 platform, which is so far known as the X670. According to a report that's floating around the internet, AMD will be launching the Ryzen 4000 series CPUs, which of course is using the Zen 3 microprocessor architecture. And this launch will happen in the latter part of 2020. It's looking like it's going to be late Q3, but most likely probably slipping into Q4. According to this report as well, AMD will be improving the I/O yet again with the next generation boards by adding in USB 4 support. Electronic Times' report seems to tally up with several other reports regarding the release schedule for the Ryzen 4000 series, and it looks like AMD will definitely be targeting the latter part of the year, which makes sense for several reasons. For one, the launch of the Ryzen 3000 series didn't happen until July, and even then we didn't see, let's say, the 3950X launch until later on. Furthermore, in terms of manufacturing capability from TSMC, Apple will be ditching somewhat the 7nm process from TSMC so they can switch to a smaller node, which will free up resources for AMD to order more, because AMD themselves admitted that originally they just underestimated the demand for the Ryzen 3000 series, or Zen products as a whole actually, and therefore didn't request enough of an allocation from TSMC. According to two of my sources now, one of them being the same source who told me the July 7th release date for the Ryzen 3000 series, AM5 will definitely be launching next year, and it will, of course, feature support for the next generation Ryzen processors. So just to be clear here, that would be Ryzen 5000 series. The change in socket is going to be of paramount importance because of new technologies which will be emerging over the next couple of years, not least of which will be DDR5. And as I've said multiple times before on the channel, just simply having more processor cores if you can't drive enough data to them is pointless. So that is going to be of critical importance. I'm also working at the moment on another update to the Zen 3 performance metrics that I've mentioned previously. I actually have a couple of sources who are giving me a little bit of information, but I need to kind of analyze it all and put it into a coherent format, so that'll come in a separate video. And furthermore, I also have a little bit of information as well for later generation GPUs from AMD, but I'm waiting on the go-ahead from a source to give me the okay to kind of put that out into the public. So yeah, definitely stick with me here if you want that information. Oh, and I'd also like to spend a moment discussing the 8 memory channel situation with AMD's HEDT processors. So if you're unfamiliar, AMD were rumoured to be launching both an 8 and a 4 channel variant of Threadripper. So this rumour really gained a lot of traction when Kamachi on Twitter discovered on the USB-IF website references to TRX40, TRX80 and WRX80 platforms, which, given we knew that the third generation Threadripper 4-channel was going to be TRX40, it didn't take that much to then kind of take the leap to say, well, TRX80 is obviously going to be 8 memory channels, especially given a couple of other murmurs that were popping up from websites like Chip Hell at the time. So anyway, most recently, there has been no sign of it at all. It's just been completely and utterly absent. And so the common consensus was that it just wasn't going to happen, particularly given Ian over at Anantech stated, according to his sources, no one's actually heard of this thing, and it wasn't on any internal roadmaps, at least as far as people had seen. And on the face of it, that makes an awful lot of sense. I mean, we've seen the performance of the 3990X processors. 64 cores, yes, but only 4 memory channels, but despite this, it's stomping Intel's Xeon CPUs in rendering workloads, for example. However, Kamachi on Twitter still was adamant that according to what he'd learned, no, there was an 8-channel memory configuration Threadripper processor, or at least some variant thereof, on the way. So I decided to do a little bit of digging for myself, and I've learned that according to 2 very reliable sources, AMD are working on an 8 memory channel HEDT processor. Unfortunately, what they can't give me are release dates of this platform, and also what exactly the target is, because as I mentioned just a moment ago, I don't really understand how it's not going to eat into the server market from AMD. How it was explained to me is it's going to be some type of workstation platform, but then you can argue that Threadripper with the 3990WX is also kind of a workstation platform. So it's going to be really interesting to see how AMD market this, particularly given the price of the 4 memory channel solution, the 3990X, isn't exactly cheap. Although I guess it is cheap compared to the high-end EPYC processors. So once again, I'm not saying that Ian's wrong with his sources. He is generally very accurate. However, 2 of my sources now have confirmed to me that there is an 8-channel Threadripper on the way, although they're not sure whether it's this generation or its successor, the 4th generation Threadrippers. And what's really interesting as well is that Zoo recently on Chip Hell also seems to report that there is definitely a 8 memory channel Threadripper on the way as well. And once again, he is generally pretty accurate when it comes to AMD information. It's going to be fascinating to see actually what happens regarding this, because if it is accurate, I would love to see how AMD is going to position this in the market. One thing I can say as well, actually there's 2 things I can say which might lend a little bit of credibility to this. One, if you recall back to March last year, so almost a year ago now, one of my sources did tell me, the same source who told me that RDNA 2nd generation would have ray tracing, they told me that AMD were really investing a lot in workstation GPUs. So he didn't know so much about the CPU side of the stack, but knew a lot about the GPUs, and told me that there was an awful lot of focus on building cards which would most likely be RDNA based for graphics workloads, and also a lot of new Vega cards which would also be the same thing for different workstations. And it makes sense given that there have been a lot of hires at the moment on AMD's workstation initiatives. Secondly, when we were being briefed of the 3rd generation Threadripper processors and also the 3950X, which of course is the high-end Ryzen CPU, Robert Halleck, during the call, essentially said that they were changing the socket for a number of reasons, one of which was the PCIe support, like Gen 4, additional lanes, blah blah blah. But he also said that there were some features for future I/O that they were not ready to talk about there. And obviously, I don't know whether he was referring to 8 memory channels, and it would be fascinating to see whether that was the case, or whether that was completely and utterly unrelated. Furthermore, for the PlayStation 5, Sony have actually confirmed that DualShock 5 controllers will run on the PlayStation 4. This was actually Sony France that admitted this on their website, so maybe they did a bit of an oopsie and they weren't supposed to share that information yet. So it's good that, at the very least, if you go around your friend's house and they've only got a PlayStation 4 and you've only got a PlayStation 5, you don't need to worry about, oh, well, I can't play any games with them. It's not really surprising that the backwards compatibility but it's nice to see it officially confirmed. Well, I guess kind of officially, it was only Sony France that admitted this. And now, in the final piece of news, Nvidia have officially reduced the price of the RTX 2060 from $350 MSRP down to $300. This, of course, is in direct competition with the RX 5600 XT from AMD. So the problem AMD are facing right now is the RX 5600 XT is just an awful lot of money for a card which basically competes with the GTX 1660 Ti/1660 Super. Honestly, I would still suggest the Super over the Ti in Nvidia's lineup anyway, as I don't really think that the Ti is worth it nowadays, given the Super is around $40-50 cheaper, and the performance, it's kind of, well, interchangeable, really. In a couple of games, the Ti does have a lead, but I wouldn't say it's significant. Let's put it this way. If a game is playing at 45 frames a second on the Super, it's not going to be 62 frames a second on the Ti in the best situations, and often it's just a few frames difference here or there, and for $50 I would suggest the Super, which to me also made the RX 5600 a kind of a weird card anyway, because while AMD were happily comparing it against the 1660 Ti, in my opinion, the 1660 Super was the card that you would buy anyway from Nvidia's lineup, unless you were going to cough up and get one of the RTX GPUs. But now, even if you say, well, I don't care about ray tracing, because let's say that you just don't want to play any games that have ray tracing, or you're just not a believer in the technology, or maybe you don't think that the RTX 2060 has enough performance and you don't want to run it with DLSS, whatever your reasoning. The fact is, though, that the RTX 2060, in terms of traditional rasterization performance, is still considerably faster. You're looking at, well, obviously it depends on the game and what card you're comparing it to, but around 20-25% is not uncommon. And once again, at $350 compared to the 1660 Super, that's quite a step up. I think that AMD at this point are probably going to have to reduce the price of the RX 5600 XT, because quite frankly, the RTX 2060 just outperforms it for the same price point. It's going to be interesting to see whether this was another debated moment, if you recall, or whether AMD were really hoping to sell the RX 5600 at the $300 mark. Either way, I guess all we can do as usual is watch this space. With all of that said though, hopefully you have enjoyed the video. In tomorrow's video, I will be investigating the difference in the graphics architecture between the next generation consoles and the current generation consoles, in terms of how the improvements in efficiency with the new generation GPUs is going to mean a lot more performance, despite the T-flops not necessarily reflecting that. So if you want that video, definitely subscribe to the channel. It was actually supposed to go up today, but because all of this news came up with the Zen processors, and honestly because I still need to read the updated Kronos information for the 1.2 specification, because I'm going to be interviewing a couple of guys from the Kronos group later on today, so I don't want to look like an idiot. I kind of need to work on that. But as I said, that will be up tomorrow, as well as an article, so I think you're going to find that really, really cool, as there's going to be a lot of visual examples as well. With all that said though, take care of yourself. Thank you very much for watching the video. If you want to share the video, and of course do the normal YouTube stuff like giving a like to it as well, that would be highly appreciated. But for now, I'm going to let you all go. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.